Welcome, everybody. My name is Cindy Clark, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the McFarland Historical Society to our 2020 annual meeting. We're certainly very pleased to see so many wonderful faces here today, and want to thank you all for coming, for giving up this rare sunshiny day for our meeting, and for joining us to learn a little bit more about McFarland history and what we're doing as a society, and also to hear our guest speaker later, Simone Munson from the Historical Society, about Wisconsin's role in the women's suffrage movement. Today we're going to begin with a few business reports, then we'll have individual reports about new things at the museum, new exhibits and events of the past year, and then we will have a very special recognition of a wonderful volunteer, Ginny Dodson, and move on to new nominations and election of new board members. Take a short break, and then after that, we'll come back for our guest speaker. So let's get started. Right now, I'd like to introduce Dale Marsden, our president, who will open the meeting.
Just like to say a few things about what we've done this last year. We had a pretty busy year getting the museum set up. We moved some displays around and added some new displays, and you'll hear about those later. We had several members walk in the parade on Memorial Day, and we had an opening on Memorial Day with a food stand out front. We planned a strawberry shortcake social at the Larson House, which got rained out. And then a little later, we had a picnic at the Larson House. And then in October, we had the third graders walk through the cabin, and we did some more work on log cabin, which needed some more work in sealing up the walls. And then the Larson House had its holiday decorations. So that's pretty much what we did this year, and we'll go on from there. So now we have Jane come up to the minutes from last year.
The minutes from our meeting, our annual meeting in 2019, were on your chairs. And I'm hoping you had a chance to look at them, and I'm looking for someone to make a motion that we accept the minutes from 2019. Okay, Dick Cole made the motion. Okay, Marcus seconded the motion. All those in favor? Motion carries. Thanks.
And we have Jackie Landrud come up with the treasurer's report.
The treasurer's report was all on your chairs. There's two sides to the paper. One side is the Larson House Museum. We started the year with a balance of $14,003.98, and the total income for the year was $3,574.25, with expenses being $6,516.09. So that account has an ending balance of $11,062.14. And the other side of the sheet then is the Main Street Museum, which had a starting balance of $11,076.51. And the income there was $5,990.04, with expenses being $5,217.85, and the ending balance on that account is $11,848.70. So the Historical Society bank balance with the two accounts together is $22,910.84. Our Edward Jones account, as of 1/31, we had a gain of $4,963.91. And after this week, we don't know. And we're scared to look. So that concludes the treasurer's report. Is there a motion to accept? Ginny? Ginny moved to accept. Second? Thelma? Thank you.
All in favor? Aye. And then Cindy, you can come up and finish the meeting.
Thank you, Jackie and Jane and Dale. Now we'd like to sort of take you on a walk through some of the projects we've been involved in within a little more detail. Dale, you want to come back up and talk about the third grade tours?
Dale, there's a clicker there for you. Did you see that?
Okay.
So you can advance the slides.
Okay.
Yeah. So you just hit that advance.
Yeah, in October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, we had 6 classes come through the museum. We had one day that was rained out, so a couple of classes did not. Oh, I'm sorry. A couple of classes did not get to go through the museum. We had guides this year were myself, Mary Friend, Jenny Nichols, Jane Licht, Carol Beck, Cindy Lark, Rod Clark, and Candy Mooney. And here's Wes starts this presentation out, and then you got some pictures of some of the students with us. And there's Mary Friend, and there's back in the cabin again. So the teachers that were there were Mrs. Rowley, Mrs. Griffin, Mrs. Case, Mrs. Schwerzik, and Mrs. Eckel, and Miss Lown, and Mr. Joyce. And the kids got to spend time in the museum and the cabin and the annex. Thank you.
They didn't just get rained out. We happened to be there that day, and it was the day when there were all kinds of warnings of lightning and really severe weather. So all of a sudden, the teachers are getting beeps from school, and it was back on the bus. We're out of here. Can't have the kids out. So it was quite a production. But the kids that did get to see it really enjoyed it. Wes, would you like to come up and talk about some of our new exhibits?
Good afternoon. We had a very busy fall in 2018, and it just kind of continued on into the winter of 2019, especially after the annual meeting. We began a major haul of our permanent displays in the main museum, and one thing led to another, and all in all, we had 7 new or restructured or museum displays in our museum, not counting the notable women of McFarland. Will this do it, that arrow? No, it's not. Magic, huh? Okay. So this is our double-pointed rowboat, and obviously it's the key feature in the new edition. To this boat, we added displays on fishing and boating and swimming from the many resorts that dotted the Lake Wabisa shoreline. And these are pictures of swimming and boating and fishing on stands that we got from the McFarland State Bank. Bars Resort and Larson's Beach Resort each operated a store with sales and rentals from boats to cabins, fishing equipment, bait, and everything else that tourists and local residents would need to enjoy the lake. Winter activities included ice fishing and ice harvesting. And lot of folks participated in construction of these displays and moving everything around. I think all the men on the board of directors and Jane and Cindy and Carol Beck were contributing their ideas and skills to put this all together. I happen to be hosting the day that Ole came to visit the museum, and he wanted to see our new Wabisa exhibit, and it's not funny yet. He marveled at the double-pointed rowboat, and he said that it reminded him of a boat that he had a long time ago that he used for ice fishing. And he said that he and Sven finally gave it up because it took too long to chop through the ice to put the boat in the water. So this is another new display. We used a life-size photo of a very early Maxwell automobile for a new display in the main room. And in the very early 1900s, the Maxwell was part of the big three car firms, along with General Motors and Ford. Interesting note is that the Maxwell was specifically marketed for women drivers and aligned itself with the women's rights movement. Can anybody name the late comedian who kept driving his Maxwell long after it stopped production? He was a very stingy person. Who was it? Jack Benny, you're right, absolutely. So after putting up the 3 panels of the Maxwell photo for a backdrop, we moved in a display case, which is just on the edge there on the left, and added other items from vintage automobiles that we had been keeping in storage for some time. We also borrowed some historical items from Harlan Hovland of Ken's Automotive for this display. One particular item, and Dick Cole, will you hold it up or point to it there? It's a super thick 1929 National Service Manual for starting, lighting, and ignition. And it's this thick, and it's got information on 103 different car manufacturers, plus countless different models from each manufacturer. So it's got everything you ever wanted to know for something that was 1929 or earlier. And when I took Ole around to this display, he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "that reminds me," he says, "of my old early Ford automobile," he said, that Lena gave me for my birthday present. And I kind of looked at him, he says, "Yeah," he says, "we've been dating for a while, and Lena picked me up with her old car, and she drove around town for a while, and then she headed into the woods." He says she proceeded to take off all her clothes and spread them on the ground. And he said, she looked at me, she winked at me, and she said, "Ole, for your birthday, I'll give you anything your heart desires." Ole said, "Well, I just knew those clothes wouldn't fit me, so I picked the car." Last February, Jerry Apps was our key speaker, and he spoke about his book, Simple Things. And so we came up with this idea for our window display with a little change on the title. These artifacts that we have in here were ingenious, I think, in their construction or technology for some time. For the time anyhow, we have a lot of things that are just made with wood, and one is a wooden vise there right next to Gene Blackmore that is pretty intriguing. We also have a wooden sausage stuffer and a one-piece hand-carved wooden shovel. And later technology, we have a hand crank wall phone, which some of you probably remember. We have an early Edison disc phonograph with discs that are really thick. And we have a coin counter that the bank used. These were marvels of technology in their own time. And I hope you take a look at them as well. Ole looked at all these inventions and he says, "You know, I think the shovel," he says, "is the best." He said it certainly was groundbreaking. So I invite you to come in and see all the changes with our museum. bring your relatives and friends. If you just contact a board member, we'll be happy to open the museum up almost any time you have guests that you'd like to do something with, and we think it'll be worth your while. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Now I'd like to introduce Paula Niedenthal. She will speak to us about the Notable Women display, part of which is on the tables over there. So during break, if you want to take a look at it, it's a real interesting display. Paula.
Good morning. So, in part inspired by the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, both Jackie Utter and Cindy Clark had the idea of considering the importance of, and historical and social importance of women from McFarland, who are pictured here. And so in order to mount this display, which is now in the lobby, if you haven't seen it yet, oh, I don't even know how to use this. This way? We first started out by generating the categories that women from McFarland might have represented who became notable. We also, by the way, limited our selection of these women to people who are no longer alive. And we generated these categories of interest and possible notoriety: education, journalism, business, civic affairs, church, military, and history. Many of these women who we nominated actually represent more than one of these categories, but they helped us choose the people that we might wanted to focus on. We also noted in our generation of the names, and Jackie certainly noticed it, was that there were far more women that were notable and who represented these categories than we could possibly represent in the lobby. And so, you know, the winnowing was a difficult job, which everybody remembers. So after all the winnowing, these women represent the final group of women of notoriety and of notable women in McFarland. For each of these women, and you might know some of them, my grandmother is there, Dorothy Helmke and Ruby Larson, and other people who I had never known, but I know the names. For each of these women, a member of the board of the Historical Society researched their background, the importance to McFarland of their lives and their work. And for each one, we wrote essentially a paragraph that's framed. There are a number of them over there, and located a photograph on that particular representation. So then we contacted members of the family or our own families, in some cases, friends or people who are current business people, in order to acquire certain of the artifacts of these women, or artifacts that represented their involvement in the community. And so one night after, as we collected these, we put them in the museum, and then one night after a board meeting, we set this up. So you can see that we have different kinds of artifacts. For example, Ruby Larson's actual bunad, her folk dress, Norwegian folk dress. We set up many items. You can see this now continuing. Items that might have been at Larson's Beach, other of the businesses with which Ruby Larson and others were involved. There's the original desk that my grandmother, Dorothy Helmke, wrote at when she was writing about the social life of McFarland for the, at the time, McFarland Community Life. Original sign and signages from the businesses that these women worked at. So we'd really appreciate it if you came by and looked at that before it comes down. I think it's going to continue for probably another 4 months or so. Is that right? Through 2020. Okay, so another 7 months. So it's worth reading, and if you would like to hear about some of the information of these women, then we brought that there today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. One of the things we've been doing in the last couple of years is trying to create digital records of some of our artifacts. Among them, last year I think I spoke to you a little bit about creating a digital record of items related to Mary Lister Nelson and Mary Edwards and their pilgrimage to World War I battle sites or graveyards where their sons were buried in 1930. We followed up this year by digitizing a series of postcards that were brought to our attention by a gentleman named Dennis Bork. He's a postcard collector and lives in Cottage Grove. He goes all over the country, and he, over many years, collected 240 or 50 images of the resorts on Lake Waubesa. So we scanned those and have created a digital record. We do not have that up online yet. Our intent is to do that before the year is out. But we do have a continuous slideshow that we set up in the boat room at the museum. And actually today we have part of that during break will be on display here. It's very, very interesting to look at those as a historical view of what the lakefront looked like versus downtown McFarland, and recognize that at the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, there were farms between Main Street and the lakeshore, and people came out on weekends from Madison to visit the resorts. On some of the postcards, the people noted that they were from Rockford or Janesville or Milwaukee, Chicago, and they would spend a week here. And it's just fascinating, and it's fascinating to see what the area looked like at the time. We also have created displays with copies of the slides that are permanent displays of people and the cottages that are there. Some of the buildings that were cottages have been transformed into houses now. It's kind of fun to go through the neighborhoods down along the lakeshore and see if you can see any of the skeletal remains, if you will, of what those early cottages were like. Also on our digital archive, if you will, we have slides from some of the Norwegian items that are in the museum. These are available to people. I'll show you some of the postcards while I'm talking. At a site called Recollections Wisconsin, which you can reach at by searching for Recollections Wisconsin, or I've left some flyers at the desk that'll show you. We'll talk to you about how to get there, and you can look through all of the items that are displayed under McFarland Historical Society. These are some of the postcards. This is a hotel and store at Edwards Park. This is a Park Pavilion at Edwards Park, the original one. This is a boat arriving at Edwards Park. There were boats that would come out from Madison. People would come out for the day, and it was a regular boat trip. Mostly people who, at one point, people came, and there was a train stop at Edwards Park. It was just a spot in the area. Yes? It's where where the Green Lantern is. This was a path. At one time, there was a promenade that went from the lakeshore here all the way around the lake, all the way up to the Green Lantern. And it was a public promenade that has sort of disappeared into the netherworlds. Here's the train stop, the Waubesa train stop. This says Edwards Park here. This is Larson's Beach, which is now where the new condos are. Some of the smaller cottages. some of the bigger boats. These young ladies came out and were spending the week here. Some of the, when I digitize them, when I scan them, I also scan the backs of the postcards. They aren't necessarily related to anybody in the village, but they're little vignettes that are interesting of the time. Okay. So that's our report on the digitization project. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jane to talk a little bit about what happened at the Larson House this year.
Well, we had a very busy year at the Larson House. But before I get into this little slideshow, I wanted to mention the fact that we depend heavily on our volunteers. We both at the Larson House and at the museum. And without the volunteers, we simply could not operate. And in addition to, this is in addition to the board of directors. So right now, I'd like for everyone who has ever volunteered at the museum or at the Larson House to please stand. Thank you very much. Okay. Let's see. The year begins with our spring cleaning, and we clean both inside and out. This is the Patrick Miles and his family who are cleaning the front porch, and a group of ladies clean the inside, and that's, of course, a very important function. And by the way, if there are any of these activities that you want to get involved in, be sure to let me know, because we'd be happy to have you join in the fun. As Dale said, unfortunately, our Strawberry Shortcake Social fundraiser was rained out this year, and a lot of people were very disappointed because the strawberry shortcake is wonderful. We did have a picnic at the Larson House that was a lot of fun, and we actually had a very nice menu, even a dessert table. And the folks who came really enjoyed themselves. And we want to thank Carol Pingle and Al Schneider for providing the entertainment, because they were John and Julia Larson. And here they are. They have their filmy stuff on because they're representing ghosts, you know. And they actually went inside, and we invited people to go inside with them, and they talked about the Larson House, and they talked about living in McFarland in the early days. And they even went to the piano, the grand piano in the living room, and they sang a couple songs, just as the Larson family did many, many years ago. So that was fun. We have a very active garden committee at the Larson House. Here are some of the members of the garden committee. You see that they range in all ages, from the very young to the older folks, the veterans. These are just some of the people. Actually, right now we have 13 members of the garden committee, and everybody has something to do. One of our big projects was to edge all of the flower beds with brick. And this started out as kind of a small project. We were just going to, Ginny, who was the chair of the committee, was suggesting that we just edge the peony bed in the front yard. But Jim Harride rented an edger from McFarland True Value, and he had 4 hours. And so he decided to just keep going. And so all of the gardens were edged, and of course we needed more brick to do all that edging, and Bill Mitchell came with his great big huge flatbed and got a bunch more bricks, I think over 500 bricks from McFarland, from the Menards. And then we set the bricks in, And we had, a lot of people working on that, setting the bricks and kind of pounding them in. And now it just looks lovely, and it really helps with the mowing and the weeding as well. Oh, sure. Sure. Members who are here from the Garden Committee, and Jim Harride, and anybody else in the mowing crew? Okay, thank you. So the Garden Committee held a plant sale, which was very productive, and they used the money from the plant sale to help pay for all those bricks. Then comes Christmas, or November and December, and we have a crew of gentlemen who move Christmas trees and tubs of decorations from the attic and from the basement to the various rooms in the Larson house. And then we have ladies who come in and decorate the various rooms. And these particular ladies decorated the dining room. And the dining room won the most votes. It was the most popular room. Everyone gets a chance to vote when they come through, And for our very Victorian Christmas and for the other open houses on Sundays in December. One new thing that we offered for our very Victorian Christmas and for the Christmas open houses was a wedding dress display. And this turned out to be very popular. And we had, I think, 11 wedding dresses from 1884 all the way through 1977. And these dresses, many, I think most of them had a real strong connection to McFarland. And so we had the wedding dress, and we also had a little information about each wedding dress. This particular wedding dress is special because Dick Cole saved it from the dumpster. He did a dumpster dive, and he happened to be there when Sandy Larson was throwing out her mother's wedding gown. And I'm so glad he did, because it is so beautiful, and even the veil is there, too. Okay, yes. Okay, let's do that. Everyone who helped with the Christmas, either moving tubs, moving trees, decorating, please stand up. We have another group. Yay! Very good. Okay, so let's see. Here we are in February. We tried something new. I think it was Marlene. Yeah, I think it was Marlene's idea. Marlene Richard said we should have a murder mystery at the Larson house. And so we did. And this is our committee. I know they look rather unusual, but they worked quite well. And we ordered I think Renee Roddick was the one. She's the maid over here, the sad-looking maid. She ordered a murder mystery, Death by Chocolate. And there was a murder upstairs in one of the rooms. We discovered a body. Oh, dear. Billy Bonka was murdered, and he was supposed to attend the dinner party. And the detective, McClue, also known as Wes Licht, showing off the body. Okay. Oh, and here we are discussing at the dining table. I'm explaining to the guests why I can't get rid of these unusual and creepy-looking staff people. And here are the guests, along with the detective and with Norma Bates, the hotel proprietor. Anyway, we just had a great time. It was just so much fun. And we did earn a little money, and we actually would like to do it again. So if you're interested, let me know. I think that's the end. Yeah, that's the end. Okay.
If any of you, I would like to reiterate what Jane said and thank everybody for being involved, but if any of you see something that you haven't done before and you want to switch your allegiance, I'm sure it would, feel free to do that. We've got a lot of opportunities at the museum. Now I'd like to bring Jane back to talk about and introduce our very special and extraordinary Volunteer of the Year.
Okay, for me, this is the highlight of the whole evening here. You know that we have people who are visionaries, who have big ideas, and then we also have people who are doers, who sort of execute those big ideas and make them a reality. And I think in Ginny we have someone who has both of those qualities, and it's quite rare. And so we're going to have our little slideshow and show you some of Ginny's activities for the Historical Society. And she, by the way, she also has other activities and volunteer work that she does for other areas of the community. Ginny is a lifetime member, so we can't give her a lifetime membership, so we have something else instead. So if you would come up, Ginny, and receive a little gift basket from us.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, and just take a look.
Well, I just wanted to say it's a great honor to have been singled out in this way. As you can see from what's been going on in the meeting so far, we have so many volunteers, and many of them could be recognized, and I'm just very honored that I was picked for this honor this year. Thank you very much.
Bravo, Ginny. It's been a pleasure to work with you on the board. Thank you. Now, if Dale would come up, he's going to ask for nominations for board members and move there.
Okay, our current board of 13 members is Carol Beck. Could you all stand as I mention your name? Carol Beck, Cindy Clark, Rod Clark, Ginny Dodson, Dick Cole, Joe Larson, Jane Licht, Wes Licht, Paul Niedenthal, Claire Utter, Jackie Utter, and myself, Dale. And Bob and Annette Kolek were leaving the board this year, earlier this year. So we will honor them at a later date. They aren't here. Currently, we have 2 nominees for the board. Gail Aaron, are you here? She is. Okay, and Jeff Rice. Okay. And then, so do we have any other nominations from the floor? Okay, if there are no more nominees for the board, I make a motion we accept the board plus the nominees that we mentioned.
Dale, I would so move.
Okay. And do a second. And all in favor, raise your hands. Thank you. Now we have a new board, 15 members now. Thank you. And
That's the way it goes, Dale. Now we'll take a 15, 20-minute break. We have snacks and some beverages in the back. The brews that are in the back, Jane asked that I remind you that they're of a particular nature because one of the biggest impediments to women gaining the right to vote, suffrage in the state of Wisconsin, was the brewery industry. Many suffragettes were also abolitionists. They did not abolitionists. They did not want people to be able to drink, and so when there was a movement to enfranchise women, the brewery industry was a big-time lobbyist against that, and certainly delayed the process quite a bit. Anyway, we'll take a break and then come back about 1:15 for our speaker, Simone Munson. Thank you. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I'd like to ask Kathy Krusek from the League of Women Voters to come up. She has an announcement.
Thank you very much. As we're going to hear now, that right here, that the state of Wisconsin first to ratify for women to have the vote. Yes, yes. And we need to thank not only the women, but the men that stood behind us because, you know, we didn't have the vote. So the men had to do that. And we wear the yellow ribbons because during the vote the yellow signified a yes vote for women to have the vote, and red was a no vote. And they actually wore roses, and at the very last, the gentleman stood up, took off his red rose, and put on a yellow rose, and we got the vote. Also, we just snuck out Illinois, being for ratification. They failed to fill out their paperwork correctly, and so we got on a train, and we went as fast as we could to Washington, D.C., and had our paperwork in and got the ratification. So the League of Women Voters of Dane County, along with the state organization and the federal organization, we are celebrating 100 years. And so I'm here to welcome all of you to March 28th. We are going to have a celebration, and it's going to be a gala at the Park Hotel. We're going to have a social hour at the top of the park, and then we're going to come down and have a beautiful dinner. And then after that, we're going back up to the top of the park into the evening to dance the night away and celebrate. And I say, do you know what? I'm only going to do this once, because in 100 years, I'm not doing it again. So if you're interested, we would love to see you all come out. You can go on to the League of Women Voters, Dane County, and hit on that, and it'll take you right in to be able to purchase your tickets. And like I said, come out and join us. This is a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the ratification, allowing women to vote. Thank you for your time.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Simone Munson from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Simone is in the collections development. She's a collections development coordinator at the Society, and will speak to us today on The Women's Hour Has Struck, Wisconsin's role in the women's suffrage movement. Simone Munson.
Hi, everybody. So you may have noticed I was struggling with technology a little bit up here, which means that two things. I have to walk over there to advance the slide each time, and this is an older version of my presentation so I don't actually know exactly what slides are going to come up because it's an older version of my presentation. So we're going to kind of fly by the seat of our pants here a little bit, but it's all going to work out just fine, and we're going to get the message across. So, oh, that's great. Perfect. Okay, so if you want to go to the first slide there, that would be great. I did not download it. Well, it's okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start talking. If someone happens to figure out how that PowerPoint's going to work, then we'll get the pictures to go along with it. And if not, then we're just gonna do it verbally today. So usually when I start talking about the suffrage movement, people often ask me, they said, when did it begin? When did the suffrage movement start? It's always a question people have. They want to know who the first was, or they want to know how it started. They want to know where things begin. How do we think about this contextually within time? So, the answer is that, across the world, women have been fighting for the right to vote and other rights for a very, very, very long time. But in the United States, we can say that since the foundation of our country, women have been fighting for the right to vote. And it was actually Abigail Adams who first mentions to her husband, she says, "Don't forget the women, Mr. Adams." When he goes off to Philadelphia to help draft the Constitution, she's writing very diligently to her husband, and there's a letter that says, "Don't forget the women, Mr. Adams. If you do," I'm paraphrasing here, "if you do, we will foment a rebellion." And so in many ways, this story is the story of that rebellion. From Abigail Adams' time in 1776, we come all the way up to 1920 before women get the right to vote. So it's about 140 years if you start with Abigail Adams. But where the movement really starts to pick up steam is with the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And it was a 2-day event. It was a 2-day event that the first day, it was all speakers. The Seneca Falls Convention was dedicated to the idea of women's rights and abolitionism. So one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit today is how the women's rights movement changes over time. And at this beginning phase in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, the women's suffrage cause and the women's rights movement was very much tied to the abolitionist cause and the ending of slavery. And so the Seneca Falls Convention, which took place in 1848, was dedicated to those two causes, but primarily women's rights. So the first day of speaking, they only allowed women to attend. It was 2 days of speaking in a large church in Seneca Falls, and women would get up there and they would they would speak, they would orate from a podium, much like I'm doing right now, and they would sort of say what they believed in, and people would have conversations, and they would talk about it kind of philosophically to figure out, did women deserve all the same rights as men? Maybe they didn't deserve all the same rights as men. Maybe they deserved a different set of rights. But they all kind of agreed that the Constitution applied to them, the Declaration of Independence applied to them, and that they deserved the right to vote. Then on the second day of speaking, they invited the men to come in because, much like the person who was up here right before me said, we couldn't have done it without the men. Because men currently had the right to vote. They were the ones who could sort of push the cause forward. And so they invited the men to come in and let them engage in the debate. And that's when the conversation also incorporated more of these ideas of abolitionism, because Frederick Douglass was one of the attendees of the Seneca Falls Convention. So as the women's rights movement progresses throughout the next 30 years, it's very much tied very closely with the anti-slavery movement, okay? And so this convention, the Seneca Falls Convention, had a lot of very prominent women who attended it, a lot of affluent and wealthy women. And it's where we first start to hear the name Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton attends the Seneca Falls Convention, and she starts orating, and she kind of builds a name for herself. And Susan B. Anthony actually wasn't at the Seneca Falls Convention, but her mother and her sister attended. And it's from the Seneca Falls Convention that the friendship between Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton really starts to be developed. It's because that's what sets the ball in motion, right? So these are probably two of the most well-known suffragists. And part of the reason why they became so well-known is for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about. The first is that they had money, and they had a patron who supported them, and they wrote a lot, and they would get their speeches and their orations printed, and they would send them out to people that they thought were supporters, and they were trying to spread the word. And the other reason why they're the money is really one of the biggest reasons why they're so well known, is because they're able to get things printed, send things out, and go on speaking tours. So they're traveling around primarily the East Coast and what we sort of think of as the Eastern Midwest, letting people know what they believe in and inviting people to support them. Okay, so it's from the Seneca Falls Convention and these early talks and this early printing that these women start to coalesce and organize. how they organize and how things get brought together, that's really what starts to create the movement. So they do this in two ways. The first way is that they start to organize suffrage associations and women's clubs. So the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association is first founded in 1869, and it's around this same time that suffrage associations and women's clubs are being formed all over the United States. So these women's clubs gave women a place to meet, a place to think about the ideas that they believed in, and a place to sort of create fundraising opportunities to help push out the ideas that they thought about. A lot of these fundraising activities and activism sort of took the form of education and welfare, because they were very, very interested in helping the causes that most closely affected women's lives. And so a lot of the ideas they thought about and they talked about centered on the ideas of children and education and how those things connected to politics, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. And then the other way that they got really organized and they started to disseminate their information is through the press. The press plays a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement from beginning to end. So I already mentioned the Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton printing their speeches and handing them out and disseminating them across the United States. But they also founded newspapers. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the first newspaper completely dedicated to women called The Revolution. And there's newspapers that spring up all across the eastern seaboard and then into the Midwest throughout the 19th century promoting women's rights. And so the newspaper ends up playing a very, very pivotal role. So one of the things that, as we're sort of thinking about the suffrage movement, is it goes through phases, and how these women align themselves with different ideas changes over time. So I already mentioned the abolitionist movement. Well, what happens is after, woohoo, look at that.
What page do you want?
Okay, go back one.
Okay.
Okay, so this is Abigail Adams, right? This is, and then I mentioned the Seneca Falls Convention. There was a woman from Wisconsin, her name was Louise Smith, who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. So there is a Wisconsin tie to it. She's not a person who got up and spoke, but she went and participated in the conference. So she traveled from Wisconsin to New York to participate in the conference, okay? Okay, next slide. All right, so the next thing that I was going to say is we also have to ask the question, who is this a movement for, right? And I've hinted at it a little bit, that the Seneca Falls Convention was primarily made up of affluent white women who had access to money. Okay, so it's important to sort of put this in context, that when we talk about the suffrage movement, we are primarily talking about suffrage for white women. So the early part of the suffrage movement is aligned with the abolitionist movement, but after the Civil War, there's actually a pretty significant break, and the suffrage movement veers away from the abolitionist movement. And this is partly because of the language of the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment. So women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony felt very strongly that the 15th and 16th Amendment that gave African Americans the rights of citizenship should also include language about women. And they very famously did not support those amendments because it became very clear that women were not going to be included in those amendments, and so they felt like they couldn't support them. And it wasn't that they didn't agree with African Americans getting those rights, it was that they thought that the amendments didn't go far enough. But there are a lot of women at this time who do make a very strong distinction. They don't think that African American women should have the right to vote. When they're talking about the right to vote, they are thinking that it is a right for white women. So for the majority of the suffrage movement, the people who are speaking in places of influence and power, who have money to be able to get this done, are white women, and it does set a tone for the movement. The African American population does have their own group of suffragists that were fighting along the exact same timeline as all these other suffragists. They're just not as well remembered. So this is Sojourner Truth. And then there's also women like Mary Terrell Church, Ida B. Wells, Frances E.W. Harper, and a whole slew of others that are fighting right alongside them. It's just that their movement isn't as well remembered as the other ladies' movement. Okay. So, organizing. I mentioned already that the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association was started in 1869. It starts in Milwaukee and Madison when a group of women invite Susan B. Anthony and a number of other speakers to come and speak in Madison and Milwaukee. And after their weekend of speaking, the organization is formed. So that's when they really, really start to get organized, okay? All right, next slide. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, I already talked about them. Go ahead. Okay, so I started talking about the press. So Alice Stone Blackwell, and then if you go to the next slide, and Victoria Woodhull are two of the women nationally that are most remembered for influencing the press. So Elizabeth Stone Blackwell and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are early founders of newspapers that talk about the suffrage movement. Victoria Woodhull comes a little bit later. In the 19th century, she starts her own newspaper with her sister. It's called Woodhull and Calvin's Weekly, and they have a more radical newspaper. They're actually the very first newspaper in the United States to print Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, and they believe in some other ideas like free love. And so Victoria Woodhull is actually the first woman to ever attempt to run for president. She wasn't taken very seriously, as you might imagine. And so she does have the distinction, though, of being the first woman to actually attempt to do it. So go ahead. So one of the other things that is happening along this timeline is that women are not just fighting for the right to vote. They're fighting for equality in lots of different ways. And one of the ways that they're sort of struggling for things is in dress reform, what clothes women are allowed to wear. So we start to see throughout the 19th century that corsets become less fashionable. They become used in different ways. There's updates to women's clothing, but we still see that women are wearing very restrictive clothing. So this woman named Amelia Bloomer is credited with the invention of the bloomers, which were these very blousy, voluminous pants that women could wear. And you can see that she's wearing them in this picture. So she has a skirt that comes down, and then she wears these bloomers underneath, and it really makes it so that her movement isn't restricted as much. She talked about how dangerous skirts were, that they could get caught in things or that they could start on fire more easily. She did not wear a corset, and so she was sort of seen as very scandalous. And her ideas were seen as very, very radical. I often think, what would she think of today if she saw even the women in this room and how they're dressed? That would be scandalous to her eyes. She probably would be very proud, though, I also imagine. And eventually, her ideas are sort of seen as so radical that the mainstream women that are involved in the suffrage movement have to kind of ask her, can you just calm down a little bit, because you're distracting from what we're trying to do. So they really want to focus their goal on being for suffrage. She was not from Wisconsin. I think she was from Ohio, but I'm not 100% sure. So women do take this idea of dress reform seriously. These are Wisconsin women. This is Ada James here in the front, who I'll talk about in a little bit. But they wore bloomers, and they went around and they carried signs that said votes for women. So we often think of these women's marches as women wearing white with the yellow tunics or the sashes and the purple. But this was a more local event that took place where they all wore their bloomers in solidarity together. So, all right. This slide is sort of out of order. So this is the problem with an old PowerPoint, but this is Alice Paul. I'll talk a little bit more about Alice Paul when we get closer to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But she is another national reformer who is responsible for part of the strategy that ends up being successful in getting the right to vote, which is what these silent protests that took place outside the White House in 1917 and 18 to eventually convince President Woodrow Wilson to change his mind. Okay, so I talked a little bit about organizing and the power of the press, but we need to talk a little bit about the ideas that these women were actually trying to accomplish, right? And I mentioned a few times that the movement happens in phases. The first phase is the abolitionist movement. The second phase is the temperance movement. And so like was already mentioned before serving the beer today, which I thought was a great idea, the temperance movement and the suffrage movement are often aligned together. And part of the reason for that is because of a woman named Frances Willard. So Frances Willard is the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she advocates for this idea of home protection. So home protection is, according to her, a movement that the object of which is to secure for all women above the age of 21 years old the ballot as one needs it for protection of their home from the devastation caused by the legalization traffic of strong drink. The devastation referred to violent acts against women committed by intoxicated men, which was common both inside and outside the home. So Frances Willard argued that it was too easy for men to get away with their crimes without women's suffrage. And so she thought that by controlling alcohol, you could better regulate men's behavior, and part of the only way to do this was for women to have the right to vote. So the home protection movement was actually a very convincing movement. It was used to garner support from average women who previously had been more suspicious of the suffrage movement because while women's newspapers were supportive of it, patriarchal newspapers, so the more mainstream press, was not supportive of the suffrage movement. And so most women were sort of hearing the opposite of the voices that were heard in those women's newspapers. Theodora Yeomans is Wisconsin's journalist. So she writes for the Waukesha Freeman, and she starts her writing a little bit later in the movement. She's writing in the 20th century. And what she is trying to do is she has a weekly column, and she wants to be a journalist. She's one of the first 10 or 15 journalists to ever have a steady career in Wisconsin as a female. She's writing for the Waukesha Freeman, and at first she's very much regulated to topics that are deemed appropriate for females. So she writes about local travel. She writes about gossip and sort of happenings around town, and all of these sorts of things that women are allowed to write about. But eventually, she's granted permission to write a weekly column about the suffrage movement. And actually, her columns in the Waukesha Freeman are one of the best historical sources that we have for what's happening in the suffrage movement in Wisconsin, because she consistently wrote every week this column, and she was giving an update on what the women of Wisconsin were doing. So if they were holding meetings or rallies, or if they were going to travel to Chicago or Washington, D.C., or what the outcome of certain votes were. She was very much aligned to this cause, and she was writing about it every week. So Carrie Chapman Catt is another Wisconsin suffragist, and she works very closely with women like Alice Paul, who end up having the successful strategy for how women eventually get the right to vote. All right, so here are some of these other tactics that they do. Go ahead. Okay, so the state-by-state movement. So along with the temperance movement, the other thing that's happening is what we call the state-by-state movement. And that is, if we think about those levels of government that we learned in civics class, right? We have the federal level, the state level, and the municipal level. There's a lot of women who figure out early on that getting something through the federal level is going to be next to impossible. So they're going to start at a lower level. They're going to start at the state level, or they're going to start at the municipal level, because they think that winning these small battles will eventually have a bigger draw to the federal level. Okay, so they start advocating for what we call partial suffrage or state-by-state suffrage. And actually, the first state to grant any kind of suffrage is Kentucky. They grant partial suffrage to women in 1838, and women are allowed to vote in school elections. So anything related to school matters, they're allowed to vote in. But the state that gets to claim the first state to offer state suffrage is Wyoming. So I really love this map because it shows a lot of different things. So Wyoming is the first to grant state suffrage. They grant state suffrage in 1869, and they actually write it into their state constitution. And the men of Wyoming are pretty smart and also a little bit desperate, and they need women. And so as they're drafting their constitution, they say, how can we get more women to come to Wyoming? And they're like, we'll just give them suffrage. So they give women the right to vote. They write it into their constitution, and they convince more women to come to Wyoming as a result. I don't know exactly how effective it was, but I think it worked a little bit. And then after Wyoming does it and sees a little bit of success, we start to see other Western states writing women's suffrage at the state level into their constitutions as they're being formed, or having a vote to pass it shortly after. So one of the reasons why I like this map is because the colors actually work in black and white. The white states are states that have granted state suffrage, and this map was created right before the 1912 election. So in early 1912, this was the state of the country. The gray states had given some level of suffrage. So like Kentucky offering school elections, there's varying levels of what women were allowed to vote in. Some women are granted the right to vote in municipal elections, the school elections, like I mentioned. There's some states, because the women's movement is so closely tied to temperance, that they allow them to vote on the issue of liquor licenses, thinking that that will sort of placate this connection to temperance. But one of the things that's also very obvious about looking at this map is that the East Coast and the South in particular are very anti-suffrage. Those are the most difficult states to get any sort of movement on, which is sort of surprising. So the women's suffrage movement is one of the few movements in the United States that goes from west to east instead of going from east to west. Because usually when we think about political change in our country, it starts in the East Coast and moves west. But this movement was the opposite. They had plenty of women, that's right. And even states that are progressive on the East Coast, they're very much, they're nervous about deregulating women in this way, that because they don't know what the outcome will be. They're very worried about the women's vote. Yeah. What was their main argument against women's vote? Yeah, so it's one of the most common questions I get is, what is the reason why people were anti-suffrage? So we have to remember that it's not just men who are anti-suffrage. There are lots and lots of women who are anti-suffrage. And the number one reason why men and women believed that women shouldn't have the right to vote is because of this idea of the natural spheres. So at the time, there was this widely held belief that men belonged in this political sphere and women belonged in the domestic sphere, and they did not see how those two things overlapped. And so they just thought that that was a natural division of the sexes, that was how things were supposed to regulate themselves. And so they did not see why women should be allowed to vote, because we don't belong in that political sphere. So that's the most common argument that's used. There are people who say also that it would double the irresponsible vote. So that's another common argument that's used, is that you'd be doubling the irresponsible vote. So like many people thought you should put restrictions on immigrants voting or the poor voting, non-landowners voting, the same idea with African Americans voting. They sort of grouped women into that category as well as being non-voters. So there's lots of different rationale. There are people who think that women are represented by their husband's vote, so there's no need for them to have the vote because there's a vote for that household happening. And so there's a bunch of different reasons why people are anti-suffrage. So the state-by-state movement is the most popular movement that's happening across the United States from about 1870 through 1910. This is really where women are focusing their efforts, right? And we've already described a little bit why this is an uphill battle for Wisconsin women because of the temperance movement. You can't convince the taverns in Wisconsin to vote for suffrage, and a lot of that is also linked to the German heritage of Wisconsin, that it's hard to convince German men in Wisconsin to vote for suffrage as well. And so Wisconsin really has a hard path ahead of them if they're going to get state-by-state suffrage. So just to explain the process here for getting state-by-state suffrage, in Wisconsin, what you have to do is you have to introduce a bill to the state legislature, and it has to pass. And then the very next session of the state legislature, the very next year, it has to be introduced again, and it has to pass. And then after it passes 2 consecutive years, then it goes to a referenda, and the men of the state vote on the referenda to decide if women get the right to vote. So in 1912, you'll see that Wisconsin has a question mark next to it. And the reason for that question mark is because Wisconsin was up for a referenda that year. So it was a very long process, but eventually they do get a bill through 2 consecutive legislative sessions, okay? And in 1912, it comes up for state referenda, and the men of Wisconsin, they speak pretty clearly, and they vote down women's right to vote by a vote of 1/3 to 2/3. So 2/3 against women having the right to vote in Wisconsin in 1912. And this really was an instance where the entire country was watching us because they really wanted to know if Wisconsin could do it. They thought Wisconsin was kind of a political testing ground for a lot of different things at the time because Midwestern states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois were seen politically to align more closely with some East Coast states. And so women on the East Coast were watching very closely because they thought, you know, if Wisconsin can do it, we can do it here. And so they were very, very disheartened when the referenda failed in 1912. Go ahead. Okay. So there is a short little story that happens before the 1912 referenda. In 1887, Wisconsin is trying to figure out if they're going to pass those legislative bills back to back, and there is a bill that's introduced to allow women to vote in school matters. So they passed this bill in 1887 that allows women to vote in school matters. And this woman is Reverend Olympia Brown. She's from the Racine-Kenosha area, and she's one of Wisconsin's most well-known suffragists. And she says, okay, they passed this bill that says women can vote in school matters. I'm going to test it. So they don't really define clearly what school matters are, but it's pretty much assumed that what they meant was the school board, that you could vote for the school board. But Olympia Brown says, well, the mayor of my community has an impact on the schools, so I'm going to vote for mayor, and I'm going to vote for school board, and school funding is determined by the treasury, so I'm going to vote for municipal treasurer, and I'm going to try and vote for some of these other offices too, because I think that they all have a connection to school matters. So she goes to the polling place, and she attempts to vote in every municipal election for her community. And surprise, surprise, her ballot is confiscated from her. She's not allowed to cast her vote that day, and she has to sue the state government to be allowed to vote in these school matters. And what ends up happening is she loses her case. So the state decides 2 things. One, you can't interpret it to be all municipal elections. That's not what we intended. But the problem is that they didn't write the bill with enough specificity to say what they did intend. So it kind of sends it into this back into the political legislative sphere. And the other thing that they determine from this case is that it's not fair to hand Olympia Brown the same ballot that we hand the men, because voting is anonymous. So what if she would have voted for president? There's no way for us to self-regulate it. So they determine that they have to print a completely separate ballot for the women to vote on as opposed to the men, so that they can keep them separate. But there's all this bureaucratic process. They're not supposed to print two ballots, so the whole thing gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. And while women are technically allowed to vote in school matters beginning in 1887, women aren't actually allowed to exercise that vote until either 1900 or 1901. There's a little bit of conflicting information. So it takes a good 15 years or so, a little less than 15 years, for the legislature to straighten out all of these policy issues, and women can vote in school matters beginning in around 1901. All right, so I talked already about temperance and suffrage and the 1912 referenda. All right, so the 12 referenda fails, and what do? So the women of Wisconsin are very disheartened after the 1912 amendment fails. And what we actually see are a lot of the women who are most involved in the movement from Wisconsin, they kind of jump ship around 1912, and they say, state-by-state suffrage is never going to work in Wisconsin. If Wisconsin is going to get it done, we got to go all the way up to the federal level. And that's when we start seeing Wisconsin women showing up at the federal level advocating for a federal amendment. So Theodore Whitten Yeomans, she's still writing her column. Women like Olympia Brown, she ends up moving to a different state, and she ends up speaking on the national stage. Women like Belle LaFollette are speaking on the national stage, trying to advocate for a federal amendment. And Carrie Chapman Catt, whose picture we saw a little bit earlier, she starts to align herself with Alice Paul and this idea of getting a federal amendment. And what they decide is that all these fissuring movements that are happening, so the temperance movement, the state-by-state movement, there's some women who are aligning themselves with what becomes known as the peace movement, that they can't have all of these fissures in the movement, that they have to unify and organize together under an overarching movement in order to successfully advocate for a federal amendment. Go ahead. So the big game changer in the whole movement is World War I. So World War I is influential in a couple of different ways. First of all, women in France and Great Britain have already achieved suffrage. And so the women of the United States are able to say, our allies have women's suffrage, but you're not offering it to the women of this country. And that is actually a pretty convincing argument for a lot of politicians who try to see themselves as being forward-thinking, and the political alignment of who was on one side of the war and who was on the other side of the war was very much seen as our side is the progressive side and this side is the backward side. But this was the area where they could say, we're not as progressive as these other countries. And so they successfully used that argument. The other argument that comes up during World War I is the idea of the peace movement. So World War I is often talked about as the Great War. It was thought that it was going to be the war to end all wars. And when people talked about the idea of the war to end all wars, women had a significant part to play in that. They believed that women were the peacekeepers, that women were the ones who would bring about the peace at the end of the war. And so we start to see countries incorporating women into politics more and more as the war progresses, because they're going to be the ones that bring about the peace. And this is actually one of the tenets that eventually is used to form the United Nations after World War II. And so it's these ideas of peacekeeping and unification that start to filter into the women's movement as well. But the most convincing argument that they're able to make is how women contribute to the workforce during World War I. So with all the men overseas, and much like how we think of a Rosie the Riveter during World War II, the same movement happens during World War I. Women are working in factories, they are running farms, they are doing all the things that back home to keep the war effort going during World War I. And it's this economic element that is eventually the most convincing for President Wilson, where he says, we can't deny any longer that women make up a vital political role in society, and he eventually concedes and advocates that the legislature pass the suffrage bill. Okay, so the president sends the bill to Congress in May of 1919, and at the time we need 36 states to ratify. So Wisconsin's legislature receives their packet of information from the federal government in early June of 1919, and Wisconsin happens to have its legislature in session. It was actually a budget year, and like we all know, budget years never go on time, and so the legislature is meeting in a special session on the budget, and because they're in session, they're one of the first states that has even the opportunity to vote on it. A lot of other states, their state legislature isn't in session, and they just wait till the regular session before they vote on it. So that's part of the reason why Wisconsin has the opportunity to be the first to ratify. So Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan all vote on the same day. And there are lots of women outside the Capitol. There's a lot of buzz happening in the streets, and all these women are connected through a network, and there's telegraph running everywhere. And the women of Madison hear that the Illinois legislature has passed it before them, and that Illinois is going to get to claim to be first. And they're kind of disheartened. But then somebody points out, it doesn't really count until you turn your paperwork into the State Department in Washington, D.C. So Ada James, who we saw a picture of earlier, she and her father and her mother have been part of the movement for a very, very long time. And actually, David James, her father, he's the one who introduces the bill to the legislature that eventually passes for the referenda to go through. And he's a 76-year-old retired state legislator, and he's there with all the women listening to hear when Wisconsin passes the amendment vote. And they're all very excited. And then they hear Illinois votes first, and they say, if we got someone on a train and got him to D.C. first, we could still be the first. So they say, David James, we're going to get a special proclamation from the governor to allow you to get on a train and deliver Wisconsin's paperwork. And the story is that he didn't have anything with him, because when he came from Richland Center that morning into Madison, he didn't plan on going to Washington, D.C. So he's like, I don't have anything with me. And Ada hands him her pocketbook and says, go, Dad, get on the train. So he gets on the train, and 2 days later, he gets off the train in Washington, D.C. He takes a taxi to the State Department. He turns in the paperwork, and he very smartly waits for a receipt. He says, I want a receipt that I turned the paperwork in, and I want it to say that Wisconsin was the first to turn his paperwork in. So he waits for the receipt. They hand him the receipt, and then he goes outside, and he's posing for pictures with a number of the suffragists who are in D.C. So that lower picture there is him shortly after he's turned in all of the paperwork in D.C. And this newspaper clipping here, if you read the article, it talks about how he was very excited, and while they were standing outside taking pictures, the delegate from Illinois comes rushing in and puts his papers down on the desk, and he says, I would like to claim that Illinois is the first to ratify the 19th Amendment, and I guess they all just broke out into peals of laughter because they had beat him to it. So Wisconsin is the first to ratify, but we are not we still have to get 36 states to ratify. So Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify. They ratify in the beginning of August of 1920, and by the end of August of 1920, the amendment has officially been added to the Constitution. Go ahead. And so we have the amendment that's officially added August 26th of 2020. So there will be a lot of celebrating that happens this year around August 26th, not just in Wisconsin, but around the country, acknowledging women's right to vote. And women are able to vote in their very first election that November. They help elect Warren G. Harding to the presidency, for what it's worth. But there's a lot of other things that come out of the suffrage movement, right? So we have this 70, 80 year intense struggle that women go through to get the right to vote. And now you have all these women that are like, okay, now what? So 1920 also shows the establishment of the League of Women Voters, which has also always been dedicated to advocating for voter education for women in particular, but for anyone really. And so we see the establishment of the League of Women Voters in Wisconsin and across the country. Go ahead. And then the other thing that comes shortly after the ratification of the 19th Amendment is the introduction of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's first introduced in 1923, and as a result of introducing the Equal Rights Amendment on the federal level, Wisconsin passes its own Equal Rights Amendment to our state constitution as well. So Wisconsin is considered the first state to pass an Equal Rights Amendment to its state constitution. So these women are holding a sign that says Wisconsin, the first state to have equal rights, because we passed a state level amendment then. We approved the federal amendment in 1972, I believe. We're the 15th state to approve the federal amendment. So next. It's important to remember that the 19th Amendment doesn't actually guarantee everyone the right to vote. So while it doesn't particularly restrict anyone, it says women shall have the right to vote. We see that most Native American women can't vote until 1924 with the Native American Citizenship Rights Act. And go ahead. And most African American women don't really get the right to exercise their vote until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the passage of the 19th Amendment is sort of seen as opening the doors for these future acts and laws that can be enacted later on. And then the other suffrage amendment that sometimes people forget about is the 26th Amendment, which was passed in 1971, and that changed the voting age from 21 to 18. So when we think about the 19th Amendment getting passed, it would have been women over the age of 21 who would have been allowed to vote. And then, so there's a couple of things that we like to leave people with. One of them is thinking about how women have become politically involved over time. We see that right after the passage of the 19th Amendment, women don't instantly gain office. So Wisconsin has its first female legislators enter the legislature in 1926. But then after that, there is not a lot of there are not a lot of women in politics right after the passage of the 19th Amendment. It's not until the 60s and the 70s where we see the next wave of the feminist movement rise that we see women starting to enter office more significantly. I'm not quite sure what the next slide is, but let's see. So we often like to think, what can we do with our vote today? We want to leave people with a couple of different things to think about. What can we do with our vote today? Women make up 51% of the population, but we only make up somewhere between 25 and 30% of the government, according to statistics released from 2016. So as far as women's equality goes, representation in government, we still have a little bit of a ways to go. And it's really kind of interesting to sort of think about what the vote really gives us today and how we can engage in politics and how much that has changed since 1920. Is there another slide? No. But the other question that we like to leave people with is trying to think about who was the first woman in your family who would have gotten the right to vote. So I think for me it would have been my great-grandmother or if my great-great-grandmother was still alive, but I'm not sure if she was still alive. But thinking about that, it's really not that many generations ago that that in your family that you would have. I met my great grandmother, so it's kind of interesting to think that she would have been the first one in my family who would have had the right to vote. So, so that's my presentation, as unsteady as it was. If anybody has any questions, I would love to answer questions. Yes.
You didn't talk about when Wisconsin actually allowed women to vote at state level elections. But when did that occur?
So women get the right to vote in state level elections with the passage of the 19th Amendment.
At the state level as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
To what extent has this had any effect on gerrymandering?
Oh, wow, that's quite a question. To what extent has this had any effect on gerrymandering? I don't know. I'm not an expert in gerrymandering. It would be sort of interesting to figure out how voting districts have changed between 1920 and 2020. And I'm sure that, women tend to vote in certain demographics in certain ways, and I wouldn't be surprised if it has had a significant effect on it, but I've never studied that, so. Yeah. Yeah, in front here.
What do you think was the main reason that men used their vote for women suffrage?
So I think what was the main reason that men changed their minds? I think their wives changed their minds. Using whatever means they felt appropriate. I think their wives changed their minds. I think that I do think that seeing other states pass laws helped influence men in states where women didn't have these rights. And so, the strategy of state-by-state suffrage, it did work fairly effectively for a while. It just eventually it reaches a tipping point where it's not going to be more effective, and they have to kind of jump up to that federal level to be more effective. But I do think that, and the war, I think personally the war also changes a lot of people's minds too, seeing how women are engaged civically, the connection between the domestic sphere, the political sphere, and the economy all together. I think that does change a lot of people's minds as well. Yeah. So, do we ever teach this in schools? Yeah. Yeah, so there is, among historians, there's a couple things I'll say regarding that. There are people who like to point out how little representation women have in history textbooks. So I think women make up less than 10% of images and things that are talked about in history textbooks. So there are publishers and people who are working on making textbooks more equal. So I think part of it would be that. In Wisconsin, so part of the reason why I'm touring around this year is because of the First Ladies Commission. So the governor created a commission on celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And the First Lady has been heading a commission to do a lot of different things. And one of the things that they're trying to do is trying to get more teachers more engaged with teaching about suffrage. So the Historical Society and the commission have created a toolkit for teachers that's on our website. And it includes curriculum, and a lot of the pictures and resources that are used in my presentation are included in this toolkit for teachers to use. And so we're hoping, and the First Lady Commission is working pretty hard to talk to educators to help increase awareness of this sort of thing. But it is a really good example of not just women's rights and how we think about women's rights, but just how we use our vote and suffrage overall. So it has kind of multiple angles that you can kind of go with it. But yeah. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simone. That was wonderful. And thank you all for coming. With that, do we have a motion to adjourn? Anybody else? First, let me ask, anybody else have any comments, questions, concerns about the Historical Society in general? Dale, you have anything to add? Is there a second? Rod seconded. All in favor? Hey, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.